Welcome to How Could We, the podcast by Climate-KIC. I'm your host, Anne-Sophie Garrigou, coming to you live from Bonn. So as you can hear, there is quite a lot of noise around me. I'm attending SB62, which is the pre-climate COP negotiation meetings. This meeting is going to shape the negotiation and what is going to happen at COP30 in Brazil. So in this episode, I'll be having conversations with scientists, negotiators, and civil society representatives to explore what we can expect from COP30. We will look at the latest developments here in Bonn that haven't made headlines yet, the main challenges facing the COP30 presidency this year, and what's happening behind the scenes. We'll also talk about what shifts are needed at COP30 to speed up climate action and the Mutirao spirit that the presidency is bringing into the negotiation and how it is shaping the negotiation this year. So thank you for joining me on this new episode of How Could We? To start this episode, I wanted to interview a climate expert from Brazil, and so I reached out to Aline Baroni. Aline is the executive director of ProVeg Brazil, which is an organization that works to encourage plant-based shift on the food systems. ProVeg Brazil has permanent observer status within the UNFCCC. That means they're at every COP. And with Aline, we discussed why implementation is key for the COP30 presidency Brazil. Aline also talked to me about why food systems should be at the center of the COP30 discussion, and she explained what is the Belém Declaration on Plant-Rich Diets, which she just handed over to the COP30 president during the SB62 in Bonn the day before we had this conversation. What do you think is going to be the main challenge for the COP presidency Brazil this year?
I think it's very clear that there are some operational challenges to start with. Accommodation has been a very controversial aspect to it. Let's hope we can find a good solution so that everyone has a place to stay and comfortably. But in terms of the actual content of COP30, I think the biggest challenge will actually be the biggest purpose of COP30, which is implementation. And they know it. And this is why they put implementation as such an important word and notion for COP30. We have been seeing over and over again that we are coming up with new plans and new policies and new discussions. And over again, every year it lacks implementation because countries are just struggling to make those plans come true. So I think the dedication of the Brazilian government and the presidency of COP30 in implementation will be very welcome, because I think this is a bottleneck usually for climate action.
What is one shift that you think we need to see at COP30 for this implementation, for accelerated climate progress?
So, of course, I'm biased because I work with food systems, and food systems are so important for climate because 33% of the global emissions come from food systems, although only 7% of finance goes to food systems. And so one shift I would love to see is a shift to highlight and put food systems in the center of COP30 agenda. I believe that there's no climate action without considering what we eat and what's produced and how things are produced. So they listed 5 topics for the action agenda, of which one of them was very specifically food systems, and we praised them so much. And another topic of the agenda was forests, oceans, and biodiversity, if I'm not mistaken, which has also a lot to do with food systems and how we are currently producing food. So I would say 2 out of 5, that's pretty good. Let's see how this will be implemented.
I wanted to ask you, now we're on this topic. Yesterday, you handed over to the COP30 president the Belém Declaration on Plant-Rich Diets. Can you tell me what is in this declaration and why is it so important that it is in the COP30 president hands?
Yeah, so this declaration, it's a declaration basically asking national governments to prepare national plans encouraging and supporting the food systems transition towards a plant-rich food systems. I mean, this should be done actually through national policies, and this is what we're defending. We know this is a complex subject, And we know most of the times it requires a lot of articulation, it requires the involvement of many actors, but we know also that it's possible to do it because we have already had countries who, after a long period of negotiations, articulations, and etc., there are countries that currently have this national policy, such as Denmark, and now Portugal is on its way also of having a similar policy. So each presidency, they bring something from their culture to support with the process, with the negotiation, etc. And so this year, Brazil has come up with something quite different, which is called the Mutirão. And I wanted to ask you what it means for you as a Brazilian, and how do you see it shape or influence the negotiation and the COP30? So Mutirão is when a community or a group of people, they get together, they join in a task force to change something in their community. Mutirão is really a grassroots thing. And I think that this was brilliant, actually, because when we talk about the challenge that it is implementation, it is so important that we have people on the ground who will not only leverage these changes, but they will be the people who are most affected by those changes too. So it only makes sense that these people are at the heart of the action, and for this change also to have this really community-based focus. And it gives me so much hope to have a COP in democracy and to see the presidency listening to people, going to events in which there are the civil societies in there, indigenous peoples are in there, representative of the Black movements are there, and they are listening and they are answering directly to them. This is so precious. I had moments in which I was not so hopeful about the COP process. And now after they announced the Mutirão and all of the agenda, I'm kind of starting to feel confident again that we can do something real this time.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to stop this on a very positive note. I love this conversation with Aline to start us off because it captured something essential about Brazil's approach to COP30, which is this idea of the Mutirão, bringing people together for collective action. But honestly, as inspiring as that community spirit sounds, I kept wondering about the very practical mechanics of how this translates into the actual negotiations. So how do you turn grassroots energy into the technical frameworks and financial commitments that make real change possible? So that's where my next guest comes in, Genaro Godoy. He's Chile's acting lead negotiator on finance, and I've asked him all of those questions. So the COPs are obviously a very important platform for climate change negotiation, and they're a critical venue for countries to collaborate on strategies and agreement. But the multilateral discussions are highly complex, and as we'll find out in this interview, sometimes the most important decisions actually happen outside of the rooms where negotiations happen. So with Genaro, we discussed the Baku to Belém roadmap, which is a key initiative put forward by the COP30 presidency. We also talk about how climate ambition needs to be seen in a much wider context of sustainable development and social justice, and why climate policy is a very important way for governments to send signals to the private sector.
So I follow around all the finance negotiation tracks. Mainly this year, the hot potato per se is the Baku to Belém roadmap. So the Baku to Belém roadmap is an initiative led by the COP30 presidency, which they are leading consultations now with parties to understand their visions. And this negotiation came out from the new climate finance goal that was decided last COP, and it tries to expand on the scope of what was decided in terms of how can we make systemic changes around the financial system, and mainly multilateral financial institutions like multilateral development banks, the IMF, etc., in order to catalyze and unlock the finance that is needed to really scale up climate action. And this is as part of a package of the whole COP30 decisions that are going to come in harmony or in synergy to essentially unlock finance. And maybe I can just briefly mention the global goal on adaptation. That is a very key decision. Mainly the biggest decision that we're going to have at COP30 is that they are developing the indicators that will globally assess how we are progressing towards adapting to the effects of climate change. And why is this related to finance? Is that the multilateral development banks and these financial institutions need guidance on what does it mean like to work on climate resilient development, for example. So these indicators will help countries then propose projects that are aligned to these objectives that they are negotiating here as well. So we're trying to create this coherence perspective so we can tackle from a developing country perspective. One of the main challenges to combat climate change is how do we deal with adaptation? How do we prepare and transform our economies in a way that we can respond to increasing effects of climate change? So that's one side, and it's not like a negotiated item per se. It's parties giving their thoughts and working together to lead and propose these changes that will go through these financial institutions that are outside the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Mm-hmm. And one of the other key items that I'm following is the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogues that are related to the Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement that talks about how can we align financial flows towards pathways of low greenhouse emissions and carbon resilient development. Again, the word climate resilient development appears here, so it has a lot of relationship with the Baco to Belém roadmap to 1.3 trillion. And this is not yet like a negotiated outcome per se, but we have been going through a process that works in workshops where parties meet and we hear from experts and institutions on ways to align the financial system. And this is a key element, I think, for both Chile and me personally. Like the ambition of combating climate change is also about taking care about what is producing climate change. So we know that fossil fuels are the main source, the main reason why we have this problem, and the fact that we are so dependent to them. And the problem is that, especially from a developing country position, is that whenever you try to, for example, eliminate subsidies towards fossil fuels or eliminate coal-powered mines, for example, and then you are helping climate change, yes, so are you benefiting future generations, but there are impacts related to the response measures. So what do we mean by this is that we are going to suffer at the same time short to medium effects on our GDP, our gross domestic product, like the money that we produce, but also on maybe the inflation, the price of goods, and ultimately we are going against other goals that are also agreed multilaterally, which is sustainable development and the eradication of poverty, eradication of hunger, and so on. So we need to really plan these things strategically. It's not an impossible task, but we need to make sure that we are mitigating these impacts of these response measures. So all this climate policy must go hand in hand with sustainable development and the eradication of poverty.
What is one thing that is happening here sort of behind the scenes at this talk at the SB62 in Bonn that people outside of our bubble should better understand?
It's interesting because I mentioned the Baco to Belém roadmap of 1.3 trillion, so we're supposed to be mobilizing 1.3 trillion a year by 2030, right? And it's like crazy the difference when we say that number and the decision that we had in Baku of mobilizing 300 billion a year. So there's a huge gap there. Since I mentioned it's not a negotiated item here, but it is something that is led by the presidency, and so the negotiations around this and all of this actual planning for implementing the roadmap, which is going to be a report and a plan forward, is done by heads of states and ministers that are not coming to the SBs. So this is something that you also have to note, is that most of the decisions that happen in SBs and COPs are not actually being made there. Like our ministers there maybe some of them also met in Copenhagen while we are here negotiating like the same thing. So this multilateral process is very technical and they are slow, but it needs this approach of reviewing every decision that is made, so it makes sense to implement it both in the technological aspects but also with the science. And that's why we met here at SBIS as well for the subsidiary bodies meetings.
And so there is a lot of discussions around COP reform at the moment, the need for a COP reform. What's one shift that you think we need to see at COP30 or the future COPs for accelerated climate progress?
I think that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the best space that we have so far to have a global and country-led response to combat climate change. It's the only space in the world where every party is treated equally, when we all have the same negotiation power to sit at the table and agree how to move forward. But there's also a very important element of how our world works, as I mentioned, more than an element, that is the real economy, the private sector. We here at COP, we send political signals, we plan as governments how we're going to arrange our laws and give guidance, because then we don't do that here. I mean, we change our laws back at our home, but here we give like guidance and maybe make collective plans on how all of our accumulated contributions are going to be leading. But we cannot give mandates to industries. We cannot control the global trade. We cannot control how the actual companies that are polluting the environment or extractivizing are going to take measures to reduce these things. So I think for the public should not look at COP at the only place that you need to point the fingers at solving the world problems, because it's not. It's like our best way of governments getting together and trying to make joint actions in the way that our international law works, which is very slow as well. But the real action needs to be happening at home. It needs to be happening along with civil society. It needs to be happening with the companies, and that's only possible with political action, with your activism, not just in the streets, but also in how do you invest, how do you buy. And that's things that we cannot control in a meeting, with the Secretary General of the United Nations or, Simon Steele here. Like, he's not gonna, change the way that companies are producing just by talking.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for your insights on SB and COP30. Good luck for the rest of the negotiation.
Thank you.
I loved this discussion with Gennaro because this is a young negotiator that very candidly acknowledged that most of the real decisions aren't actually made in the negotiation rooms, but they're happening in meetings between ministers and head of states that we don't really hear about. It's like the curtains behind the curtains, if you will. But obviously those high-level political decisions have to be grounded in solid science, right? And they are. They need indicators, methodologies and evidence that can then guide negotiation and policies. And that's where the IPCC comes in, and why I was so eager to sit with Bart, who is the co-chair of the IPCC Working Group 2 on climate impact and adaptation. And Bart gave us quite a lot of explanation on how those negotiations are influenced by science and more of the work that is happening in the background.
Climate is fun.
Is it?
Yeah. Inspiring. Hi, I'm Bart van der Hurk, co-chair of IPCC Working Group 2, which is about climate impacts, vulnerability, adaptation.
I have a lot of questions for you today. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. One of the first things I wanted to talk about is about the IPCC 7th assessment report, which is underway, and it's about the state of climate change. Can you talk a little bit about what's in the 7th assessment report or where you are with the discussion right now? One thing I really want to talk about is the fact that the IPCC science and climate science in general, but what you're doing at IPCC, the goal is to really inform the government decision, right?
We started 2 years ago with the 7th assessment cycle, and we will produce a report on climate change in cities. That's already ongoing. Very interesting, very nice. But we're also going to produce a new report on the climate impacts and the adaptation. So this is how you should measure your progress, your adaptation. And the global goal on adaptation is something that is part of the Paris Treaty. So we ask countries to report on their progress to make adaptation goals. It's really interesting where you see science meets policy. The policymakers, they have to come to an agreement on how do we actually measure adaptation. And so they have been discussing all week already, or actually a couple of months already, about what kind of indicators actually can we define to measure adaptation or impact even. And it's not easy to agree. It's quite easy to say if you want to bring down the carbon emissions, you count molecules and see whether that goes down. But when do you do enough on adaptation? What is actually your risk currently in your society? And it's so complex. You have risks in transportation, in agriculture, in heat and health things. So that is actually also almost a political process to first define what you want to achieve. And then they ask the scientists, can you give us a couple of indicators that we can measure and that every country can then use as a reporting? And then that isn't that easy. They searched for experts to think about these indicators. They first were asking all the members of the Paris Treaty, what do you think are good indicators? You get more than 10,000 different suggestions. And so the experts took a couple of months actually to try to condense that down. And now they're at 500 or so, which is still a lot. In that report, we're also going to produce what we call a technical guideline on how to assess impacts and the adaptation. And a technical guideline is something that actually has the potential to give guidelines, to give some instructions. And then all the questions are, how is it going to help us? How is it going to be matched to our discussions? And then I have to say, well, we are bringing together the scientists and they are going to look at what you did and they're going to look at, does it make sense? Can you make a good statement? But is there other ways to measure this impact? Can you link it to your policy cycles? And we do this in order to be informing the global goal on adaptation. We really think that is helpful for their discussions. But we also say, what we are doing the science. We are doing the assessment of how the methodology could look like and what kind of indicators you could get, whether you can measure them, what you do with the enormous difference in countries that have a good Bureau of Statistics, that have nice numbers on how many floods and how many damage and how much insurance, but there's also countries that don't have that information. So what do you do there? That is our job.
Thank you. I think it's really interesting to understand how it's happening behind the curtains. And so we picked the quietest spot here at the climate meetings in June, but there is a few birds, so maybe we'll hear it on the recording. Mm. You just mentioned the report on climate change and cities. I was at a session here on cities and health yesterday by C40, which was really interesting. They were talking also about the importance of gathering data and science. I know you cannot disclose exactly what's happening in the reports because it's not out, but can you tell me a little bit about the type of discussions that are already happening?
Yeah, we have about 100 authors in 5 different chapters that are now building up their story, bring together a lot of experts that actually tell what should be the content of the report and also a bit about the chapter structure. That proposal we bring to the IPCC panel. And already during the scoping, we felt we are now working in a layer of decision making and of governance that is so fragmented compared to the national landscape, and the nations are already pretty fragmented. But now we go to the cities, and there is so much differentiation. We have a lot of scientific literature about what climate change and cities do, but almost all of the academic literature that's out there is about big cities with 1 million inhabitants or more. They can afford to build up big experiments or big model things, etc. But the majority of people live in cities that are way smaller and so little information about it. So we already, during that scoping, we concluded we need not only academics, we need practitioners. That means people that are in the governmental layers, in the municipality, consultancy, finance experts. And so we have put together a team where we indeed have a couple of people that don't have an excellent track record in the academics. And that's interesting because you already see different flavors in there. Sometimes very practical, pragmatic, and then you question, well, still a bit of work to bring that to something generic. And sometimes it's very abstract. And then you think still a bit of work needed to bring this down to the practice level. And that is interesting. But I think it's going to set a precedent for how we can bring these reports a bit closer to the societal reality.
What do you feel like are the main challenges for the COP30 presidency this year?
Yeah, I guess you see over the years the conversation is more and more about finance. Yeah. And it's about, in fact, we see the impacts. We can better and better calculate what it is actually costing, all that damage. Also what it's costing to protect yourself against it, or what it costs to get rid of fossil energy things. So money is on the table now, more and more, since the last few COPs. So that is one pretty difficult thing. Also in Belém, a lot about how much money is needed, who should pay, who should, and then what are the criteria. But I guess what's the most challenging for the presidency, to say the local organizers, is to admit that we need to speed up. It really is not going fast enough. And yet the process to come to an agreement is so slow, because you need to take time to listen to all these different views. And that is friction. You have to be fast and you cannot faster. And that is a dilemma at every COP, but time is really an issue. And the COPs have a good tradition that at the very last moment, deep in the night, the final conclusion is there. And there's always, again, under time pressure, people are able to converge on a joint conclusion. But we are going to face it again. And we hope that the outcome is meaningfully different from where we are now.
One thing that I think is particularly important this year is on the 1.5 narrative. So there is a lot of discussion. Obviously, there was a report that came out a few days ago. I think what scientists are worried about, like when we see the headlines that came out yesterday, was like 1.5 is dead. So I want you to talk a little bit about what is the message that the science community want to send to government and to people about this 1.5. Why is it still important? Why do we need to keep this as a political, moral compass and legally binding?
The science community is pretty persistent in arguing that every 10th of a degree warmer matters a lot in the impact. So every attempt people could do, they should do in order to mitigate it. So there is a consistent story from the scientists: don't surrender, stay there. But we have been thinking about our report, which is about climate impacts. And in the discussions, as part of that scoping process that we had, we also felt, actually the message that we use to launch our report is impacts are real, are here to stay. We have to get used to it. We have to not accelerate climate action as in reducing the greenhouse gases, but also accelerate that reality that, what we used to experience in terms of extreme weather or sea levels or dry climate zones, whatever, it's not going to be the same as what we will experience. So I also feel that at 1.5 degree is really difficult to reach. I don't think we're going to make it. And that's actually empowering me even more to work on this adaptation stuff and also to think about, how can we then make our societies able to cope? Don't forget, we have built a beautiful civilization all over the planet, but we have chosen the locations where our cities are, or where there's a harbor, or where we have a power plant, or where there's a hospital. It's all based on what was the climate of then? And where is the food production? Where do we have fresh water? It's the climate has dictated how that looks like, and that climate is going to be different. So we have to reorganize quite a few things in how we actually do our society. My point also is we've done that always. We always have adapted to changing conditions. There are so many things have changed over the course of the centuries and years. But we need to adapt quite fast because that climate doesn't go. I also think about, the psychological value of crossing that bridge, that threshold, which of course is giving an enormous sense of urge to some, but also a sense of despair to others. People say, oh shoot, we've lost, we give up. And that I also find difficult to commit to. I think, I've got a 5-year-old granddaughter and she will live. She will face problems that she has to solve, fair enough. And I know her future will not be without any worries. But I think Václav Havel, the Czech writer, once had a very nice quote about hope. And he said, hope is not being convinced that it will all come good, that everything will be right. No, hope is your sincere belief that it is meaningful. And I think it's sincerely meaningful to keep on investing in this, and every 10th of a degree matters. And it is sincerely meaningful to charge this and the future generations with instruments and with power, with money, with capital, whatever, to cope that future. Mm-hmm. And I would like the scientists of our report not only to raise that alarm bell, it's urgent and we're too late, but also use their ingenuity to inspire people to indeed make sense of it. And it is meaningful to stay on acting. Yeah. That is I would say the message that we would like to express.
I also have a 4-year-old, and when I was at the session yesterday with the scientists, they were talking about the overshoot strategies to go back to 1.5 after 2100, and I realized my kid will be like 74 years old by then. Yeah, so that's exactly. This entire life that they're going to have, even if we manage, still this entire generation is going to live through a world that is, so I think, as you were saying, one of the things that we shouldn't forget here, we were talking about adaptation. By showing that we've passed this threshold, that means we need more money for adaptation. And that is also guiding the discussion and the negotiations that are here. Just had one question left. I wanted to ask you, we've talked a lot about the importance, the need, the urgency to act, the need for accelerated action. Is there like something you think about, one shift that you think we need to see at COP30 for this action to actually be accelerated?
I guess the main shift that is necessary is the mental shift. It's not about the money, the technology. I think we pretty well know, but it's the mental shift that, as Václav Havel says, it is meaningful to invest in a more healthy climate and better coping capacity. And that mental shift is relevant for every individual, for every municipality, for every national government, for the global community as a whole. That I think is the shift that is required.
Thank you very much for the insight, for the conversation. Good luck for the next few days, and for you will be in Belém as well?
Yes, I will.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
And thank you for the attention for the topic.
All right, that brings us to the end of this episode of How Could We about the preparation of COP30 in Brazil. So in this first episode of 2 seasons, we heard from Aline Baroni of ProVeg Brazil, who highlighted the critical need to place food systems at the center of climate action and the exciting inclusion of this in the COP30 action agenda. We had a first introduction to the Mutirão grassroots community effort that Brazil is bringing to the negotiation table, which emphasizes like much more inclusive and participatory approach to COP. And then we talked about the crucial world of climate finance with Genaro Godoy, who is Chile's lead negotiator. And it was really fascinating discussion where, he explained the intricacies of the roadmap and the global goal on adaptation and mentioned the immense challenge of unlocking the trillions needed for climate action. And last but not least, we touched upon the essential role of science, obviously, in this negotiation, with Bart, who is the co-chair of the IPCC Working Group 2. I was really happy to interview him and to hear more about the complex process of developing indicators for adaptation and the ongoing work of the upcoming report on climate change in cities. When we see these reports, we don't always know about this amazing collaborative effort between scientists and policymakers to kind of translate scientific findings into actionable strategies, even as they navigate the vast complexities of urban environments. So yeah, for me it was really interesting. And now COP30 in Brazil is only 2 months away, and it faces still significant challenges, both logistically and in terms of like driving tangible implementation. But there is a dedication from the COP presidency to align finance with climate goals, and which offer genuine reasons for hope, really. And as Gennaro pointed out, the real impact of these negotiations lies in how they translate into action back home, supported by science and driven by engaged citizens. So yeah, this doesn't stop at the COP. We're gonna have a second episode in a couple of weeks with more experts that I interviewed during this event in Bonn. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration of what's to come. And yeah, we hope you enjoy it. Subscribe to the podcast to not miss this next episode. And I really hope this is giving you a clearer picture of the crucial discussions happening ahead of COP30 and the shifts that are needed to accelerate progress. I hope you understand that this isn't just work that is being done behind closed doors, but that is really affecting all of us. So thanks for listening. And don't hesitate to share the episode with people who might be going to COP or want to understand better what's at stake. Thanks for listening. Bye.